Sonja, I wanted to introduce as a member, longtime member of the St. Francis Yacht Club. And she is a VC, a venture capitalist, and the founder of the investment group Broadway Angels, and also founder of a nonprofit Project Glimmer. There's actually a lot more that Sonja is involved in, but this is tip of the iceberg. We also have Ellen Levy, who's managing director of Silicon Valley Connect and an angel investor and advisor to several dozen startups. So we have both had really exciting careers. So on that note, I'd love to hear from Sonja and Ellen, and just kind of start with, how did you two meet?
I bet you we'll have different answers to that, because Ellen claims I didn't remember her the first time I met her. So, but
like the first 5 times.
Well, I did introduce her to her husband though, so I redeemed myself at my 40th birthday. So I think we met at, well, one of my most memorable first meetings with Ellen, I should say, is with Silicon Valley Bank when we went on those trips to Hawaii. And Silicon Valley Bank, there was always these male boondoggles that they would do for venture capitalists. I was at Menlo Ventures and Ellen was at Neo Carta Ventures. And they decided, hey, why don't we just invite the women to come on a boondoggle? So we went to Hawaii and we were in Oahu. And I remember we rented this boat and we were all talking about like deals, technology, and boys. And none of us were married at the time. And the captain was like, who are you? And we were like, oh, we're a women's think tank. And the guy just basically wanted to jump overboard. It was so funny, but we did meet on the water a long time ago.
Oh, how great that you guys met on the water. That's really cool. Ellen, is that true? Is that your story too?
Well, her story's better, so I could leave it at that. No, we actually, you know what? I have this, I don't always share it. I have this compulsion where I always write down when I first meet people and where I met them. So we actually are coming up on our 20-year anniversary. It was just prior to what she's talking about, but we met May 3rd of 2001 at a Forum for Women Entrepreneurs luncheon for women in BC.
Oh, yeah, I remember that too. Yeah. There were very few women's things back then, so.
Yep.
Yeah. That's great. And on that note, I wanted to make sure we educate everybody, because we all have different, things that we're experts on. And what exactly is a VC and what is an angel advisor?
Which one do you want to take, Ellen? VC or
Well,
angel?
you know what? Before we do that, I know you mentioned that I did meet my husband at your 40th birthday party, but I'm not sure everybody knows my husband is Ken Glidewell. Since we have different last names, I figure I might as well throw that out there.
Absolutely.
But you know what, Sonja, you start. I'll fill in angel investor. You fill in VC.
Okay, so I've been a venture capitalist for over 30 years, and basically it's professional early stage investing. And so we have large pools of money typically that come from traditional limited partners, which are, university endowment funds, not individuals, not family offices, just large pools of money that needs to be invested. It's very professional. A typical venture capital firm has about 10 partners. It requires a lot of teamwork, and if your deal comes in and one of your partners got out of bed on the wrong side that morning, he'll probably turn down your deal. So it can be very frustrating sometimes because there's a lot of consensus there. Typically in a venture capital firm, there's focus. Some firms focus on technology, some focus on medical, some focus on consumer. It really depends. And then within a venture capital firm, you have people that have specialties. So I've specialized in security, networking, infrastructure. As boring as that sounds, it's really exciting, at least at one time. So I specialized in really kind of hardcore technology, which is really unusual for women. A lot of the women, unlike Ellen and myself, in venture tend to be in healthcare for some reason. So it's, I don't even have a technology background. The venture industry is a very small industry. It used to be one that no one had ever heard of, and now it's like the topic of Silicon Valley TV, the show. And so venture capital is really important for the U.S. economy. I don't have the statistics, but almost all new job growth comes from venture-backed companies. At least high growth companies. And so venture capital is really a cornerstone of the industry, and it's a really great industry because if you invest, dollars into the economy, into the U.S., economy, it really helps our country grow. It's like companies like Microsoft and Google and Cisco. They were all venture capital backed. And then if you lose your money, you'd lose your money. But the reason why people like venture so much is that your upside really is unlimited, and you can only lose what you invest. And so if you're good at it, it can be a really great industry. But it's been really important for American competitiveness. And I think one of the reasons why America is so great in technology is because there's a bunch of people that decided that bank debt was too risky. And because the way venture works is you put money in and the entrepreneur never has to pay it back because you buy equity, you buy shares in the company. And so if the company is worth 10 million one day and it's worth 100 million the next day, and you put in $1 million, you get 10% of that value. Or if it's worth zero, you get zero. So there's no risk to the entrepreneur other than they lose equity, but they probably couldn't grow without the dollars that went in. So it's a really good model even for the entrepreneurs. But it's very professional. It's very big.
And so you both have been in venture capitalists for a long time. Ellen, how did you start your career? What brought you there? I mean, what made you think I'm going to be a VC when there are no VCs that you know of? What was that moment where you decided?
Yeah, for me, it was I think a pretty different path. Like I came out to the Bay Area for grad school and then just never left. But after grad school, I started my career at Apple Computer. So I worked at Apple, and then I went to 2 startups in the late 90s during the internet heyday. And by the time, both of them, the first one was like 3 days from filing for IPO when we got acquired. And the next one, I'd only been there a year and we got acquired. And so during that time, I just kept getting to know everybody who was in the early consumer internet. I mean, it was just a great time to be popping around, and you could pretty much know everybody. If you were in Silicon Valley in the mid to late 90s and you were looking at consumer internet, there were only like 50, 60 companies you had to keep track of. And so a lot of my friends were doing those startups. The companies I'd been at were platform-like companies. And so I got to work with a lot of people. And so I was going on a lot of advisory boards. I was just helping my friends with their companies while I was doing mine. And so after that second company got acquired, a friend of mine who'd been an exec at Apple had become a partner at SoftBank Venture Capital. And if everybody remembers back to the late 90s, the hardest thing to do was to talk to the entrepreneur when they first had their idea. Because if you waited 3 months, they'd say, sure, you can invest. Our valuation is $50 million. Like the prices were just going crazy. And so it was a time when the early stage VCs put a premium on getting to know the entrepreneurs really early. And so I got pulled into venture for 2 reasons. One, because I actually knew a lot of the entrepreneurs starting companies, and so they wanted the connections. And 2, because I realized I didn't have to decide which company I wanted to work with. I wanted to work with a bunch of companies. So my version of going into venture was a chance to work on a bunch of problems, not just one. It wasn't really because I had strength in the financial side or any of those mechanics. I just learned those over time. So I jumped in for those reasons.
So I'm fascinated by that. What was your first job when you came out of school?
Oh, you mean my first job at Apple?
Yeah. What was your after grad school?
Well, so out of grad school, so I got my PhD in cognitive psychology, which meant I hung around Stanford for long enough that I figured out I liked golf. And I became the manager of the women's golf team, even though I'd never golfed before because it made it free. And I tell you a story because at the Stanford golf course, I met a guy who had been one of the top execs in one of the top semiconductor companies because we had this annual fundraiser for the golf teams. And so I remember thinking, okay, great guy, but like semiconductor has no interest to me whatsoever. And then the following year, he'd become the number 2 guy at Apple when that same fundraiser came around. And so it was about 6 months before I was finishing my PhD, and I just pitched him and said, I'd want to be your chief of staff. I just want to go work for you. And so after pitching him for long enough, he hired me. So I got to go in and just work out of the office of the CEO doing projects with him.
Wow. That is the story. It's amazing.
And the fun one, the Forrest Gump version of my story is that I got to be the person who went up to Steve Jobs and said, we're ready for you to present to the board now. And I took him in the boardroom while he presented Next to Apple, which is how we bought Next and brought Steve Jobs back. So,
wow. So I guess that's why they call you the most connected woman in Silicon Valley, right?
Yeah, something like that.
Is that a term it's a term, right? You're known as that.
It did get written. I think, I mean, I do like the fact that I've gotten to know lots of people, but also that was written right as I was finishing up my time at LinkedIn. Later in my career, I went and was involved with LinkedIn for its first 10 years. And so I think the journalist liked that it was playing on the fact that I had come from a big networking company.
Got it. And so Sonja, what was your first job? How did you jump into VC world?
So it's really interesting. My story is really different, and it started in 1989. So it was my first job, my first real job after college. So I went to the University of Virginia. My parents were very kind that they paid for college, but they didn't pay for clothes and all the beer that I wanted to drink. So I had to get a job. So I got a job working in the computer lab at UVA in the mid 80s, or maybe the late 80s. And that's when everybody went to a computer lab, and you had to print things at the computer lab, and nobody had there was no laptops. There was maybe a desktop, but there were not even hard drives, right? And so I was a troubleshooter, and I also wrote programs for the Department of Neurosurgery at UVA, and it was basically a census program. And I was a terrible coder, but I was the only one who could code, at least that the neurosurgery department knew of, because early PC computing was really, really young. And so after college, I graduated in 1988. I actually couldn't even get a job after college. And so I decided to go to London for 3 months through this British American exchange work program called BUNAC. And I ended up getting a job on the London Stock Exchange, working in the back office. And one of the things they were doing, which sounds terribly boring, is they were going from a paper-based system to an electronic-based system. And the program was called Big Bang. And it was one of the largest automation programs ever, going from paper to electronic. And one of my jobs was to actually check the microfiche to make sure that the document was really there on the microfiche that matched the system. It was very manual label, punching holes, all that kind of stuff. Really hard stuff. And in the end, I programmed a little bit. So I came home from my 6-month European, trip, which was really great. And I moved to Boston. I didn't have a job. My parents were like, "Why are you moving to Boston?" I'm like, "Do you want me to stay at home? Like, I'll find a job." So my first job was actually selling gift certificates at Jordan Marsh department store. And I quit because they wanted me to work the holidays, and that just wasn't going to happen. So I had a friend who I was sleeping on his couch from college, and he had actually interviewed with this venture capital firm called TA Associates, and he turned the job down for Bain & Company. He wanted to work there instead. And the person that he'd interviewed with was actually the favorite student of my professor, and I was luckily his favorite student. So this guy, Richard Tadler, calls Neil Snyder at UVA and says, "Hey, who should we hire for an investment analyst here at TA Associates?" And he's like, "Oh, you should hire Sonja. She just arrived in Boston, and the firm was in Boston." So I joined the venture industry. I had no formal degree in computer science at all, although I was a hack. And then I also didn't have any work experience whatsoever. And I always laugh because, people say, "Oh, in order to be a partner at a venture capital firm, you have to have a computer science or engineering degree, and you have to have all this operational experience." And, I didn't have any of that. And my track record is one of the best in the industry. And, it's just there's all kinds of different models for how it works. And that's why, like, our industry only has 8% women in it, which I think is terrible. It's a terrible statistic. And it really needs to change. And I put myself out there as an example of like, hey, I've had no experience. I had no, I didn't have the right degree, but I had something else that I brought to the table, which I think diversity and a way of looking at markets and a way of looking at looking at things. And so when I was at TA Associates, my job was to literally cold call every entrepreneur in America. And this is a software entrepreneurs. And software is a really great business model because the cost of goods is literally zero. And in the 80s, people thought that software companies weren't worth anything because the engineers built the product they would go home at night, and that was your product. Your product was all sleeping, in their own beds at home. But the reality was it was a very inexpensive product to distribute and sell, and it was incredibly profitable. So my job was to call, and I literally called thousands of entrepreneurs. And then I tried to find the best ones, which were growing at more than 100% a year, that were very profitable, that didn't need venture capital. And then it was my job to sell them to take money from TA Associates. And so I invested in 3 companies. One of them was called McAfee Associates. All 3 of them went public. By the time I was 24, I'd invested $27 million, and all 3 companies went public. So right now McAfee's worth, 8 to 10 billion. I didn't check it today, but so it's really been quite a ride.
I just love that both of you started. It wasn't that, like you said, neither of you had this traditional story like, oh, I went to business school and I was going to be a VC, or the golfer and the microfiche reader.
But golfing probably helped. I would bet that's been really helpful to your career, Ellen. I wish I could golf.
It does help. It's a little harder to make time for sailing when you're such a golfer. So we had to sort that out. Ken and I did. But yes, it's helped in business a lot.
That's great. And so what are we've got a lot of people here, and we all have to reinvent ourselves a little bit this year because everything's changed so much. And every age has to reinvent themselves. What advice could you give to someone who's like either just starting out? What would you do differently? I mean, I really see this common thread where you're like, just get to work, get your hands dirty, get in there with whatever you're doing. But what advice could you give, or what path do you think would help someone who is just starting out and wants to kind of make that change, or wants to change what they're doing? And that horrible word that we use too much this year is pivot into something else. Ellen, do you want to start?
Well, so a change in general or a change into venture? I mean, change in general, on the one hand, so much has changed over the last year that it's kind of created opportunities. Like I always say, even with some of the startups I work with, the nice thing about what happened, the silver lining, I shouldn't say it's a good thing, but silver lining for what's happened over this past year is a lot of things that people would have just sat back and said, I'm going to stick with the traditional way of doing things. Those options were taken away. And so it made everybody start evaluating, well, what am I going to do differently? And those are oftentimes the hardest conversations to get to take. And so once everything's open for discussion, for business decisions, that's been great for startups. But I'd argue in a way that's true for individuals with their careers too. The simple thing of working from home and geography and commute time not having to be as much of a factor. And all of a sudden it says, you can say to yourself, well, what does that mean I can be doing? And what do I want to optimize for? I also think that there's a lot of ways to kind of go reskill yourself, even while you're working, to start picking up on things that you're interested in. And you can experiment a lot on what are you interested in before you decide whether that's something you want to make a career shift to. So I just think right now is a great time for some experimentation where you don't get penalized. It's not like you made a choice. It's kind of one of those that choices are being thrust at you. You just got to pick one of them.
That's great. What about you, Sonja? Any tips that you could give someone who's...
I think we as women in general, and I hate to make generalizations, but I will about this. I think we as women, we hold ourselves back. Like we're the ones who say we can't do it. Or we're the ones say, oh, I could never do that, right? We're the ones who sit in the boardroom and say, what am I doing here? I don't belong here. Or we're the ones who turn down the promotion because we don't think we've checked all the boxes. And I know guys don't do that at all because I work with all guys, and half qualified people will say, of course I can do that. I think we should not hold ourselves back and not have imposter syndrome. I was on a panel with a couple other women VCs, and somebody asked the question and said, well, how do you get over imposter syndrome? Do you ever feel like you're an imposter, or you don't belong, or you don't fit in? And we all looked at each other like, no. We just, if you believe you can do it, you can. And if you believe you can try to do it and will succeed, you can. And, my parents, I give them huge credit because they really believed in me when I was younger. And I went to Boston without a job, and I was like, of course I can get a job. I even got a job offer, and I turned it down because that wasn't the one I wanted. My parents were dying, right? And then after business school, the same thing. I had trouble getting a job again, and I got this incredible job with this leverage buyout firm, but I didn't want to do leverage buyouts, so I turned it down. And people were like, why are you doing that? And it was because it wasn't what I wanted to do. And I think if you hold out for what you really want to do and believe that you can do it, just do it. But just remember that no one is holding you back except yourself. I mean, that is the thing to really believe.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And, I'm listening to you guys. You're both so inspiring and interesting. And was there one thing that you guys, or that you're most proud of? Like one, I don't know if that's a deal or a business idea you had, something that really you're like, oh God, it gives me chills. I just did it. I can't believe I'm here. I did it. Is there one thing? I don't know, Sonja, if you wanted to start with that.
I have a one thing. It's actually one thing, but it's really a three thing, but it's really a one thing. So I have funded a management team 3 times. A company, well, the management team are 2 guys named Andy Ori and Patrick Malampi. Their first company was Priority Call Management. They were 27 years old, or Andy was 27 years old. They had no idea what they were doing. It was basically voicemail systems and enhanced applications. But that company got sold. And then they started another company, and that company had a nice outcome. And then they started another company, and they were a lot more mature, and they were a lot more wise. And that company went public and was ultimately sold to Oracle for $2 billion. And then they started another company, and that company just got sold to Juniper for $500 million, called 128 Technology. And Ellen was also in that company as well, through Broadway Angels. And, a lot of times in companies, especially startups, literally everything goes wrong at least one point. You never meet the numbers. You're many quarters behind your revenue. The product isn't what the customer wants at the time. There's always some surprise. It's, some disaster. And the way that you handle that, with realizing that we're all on the same team versus an us versus them, which is what a lot of venture capitalists have. They think that the entrepreneur needs to do what they say, and the entrepreneur thinks that they got to just make the suits happy, right? And, but if you can put teamwork together and you can have people and build trusting relationships, with that push and pull of a venture capital entrepreneur, I think it's great. And so the idea that I got to fund Andy Ori and Patrick Malampi 3 times is just an honor. And I would say that 1/3 of my portfolio are with people that I've backed before. And, I'd much rather, instead of having a transaction where, one person wins the most and the other one doesn't, I'd rather build a relationship where everybody wins. And I think over time, so that creates just a better environment and a better long-term business strategy, even though a one-time transaction might be very appealing if you think you can get away with just a little bit extra.
Yeah. How about you, Ellen?
Yeah, I have the more obvious answer, and then I have a less obvious answer. The more obvious one is in my career, I think going through the whole process with LinkedIn. So I joined as an advisor right as the company was being founded. And I had known Reid Hoffman from before he got the idea to start it. And so working on that from the get-go and then straight on through, like I said, for the first 10 years, so that was up until a year after the IPO. It's a fun thing to go through the entire life cycle of a company, from getting the idea going. And, now LinkedIn is kind of everywhere. But there were days early on where people thought it was dumb and questioned why we thought this was worth having. And, it's a sad sight for people who don't have jobs, and that's all it's ever going to be. You really do have to have a lot of conviction, but seeing all that through and seeing it grow to be kind of a pretty standard utility, that was actually, I think, one of the more proud kind of standard business things I've done. The one that I always think about is different. It's so right after college, I went to Michigan undergrad. I graduated and I worked for 2 years before I went to grad school. And the first year was Price Waterhouse and their technology core consulting group. So I was basically a product manager. They just didn't call it that. And after a year, I realized it wasn't the right job for me, and I quit, which back in those days and not Silicon Valley was very unusual, but it just wasn't working. And I ended up filling that next year working for Harvard, helping plan the International AIDS Conference. And if you remember back to like 91, 92, that's when the epidemic had just crossed the number of deaths that we'd seen in Vietnam. And, there were all these, and it was a death sentence. We thought there was no solution that would let people live with HIV. And so I ended up helping plan the International AIDS Conference, which was 15,000 people in a foreign country, which was we went and held it in Amsterdam for a week. And just working on such cool, amazingly important issues. It was like a microcosm on society. I look at a lot of stuff we wrestle with today, whether it's because of the pandemic or other things. You can take that same kind of structure of all the issues you have to think about, from social to the basic science. But that's the one that both being able and willing to step out and do that, but also it's just kept me grounded. Like when the worst things are happening in one of my Silicon Valley startups, I'm like, this is nothing. Like, this is great that we're fighting these little business battles and we've got these issues, but truly life and death and a bunch of other things. I mean, look, you do it all day long. Folks in medicine, I think it's a different kind of grounding. And so I got a little taste of that when I was working for Harvard that year.
Oh, that's so great. And I know, Sonja, you're really involved with a not-for-profit, Project Glimmer. So it sounds like you both really have some passions in the not-for-profit world in helping others. And I think that is such a guidance. And I know, Sonja, tell us a little bit about Project Glimmer. I know it started right at the Yacht Club, right?
It did. It started in 2009 when I attended the lighted boat parade, and that's never in the story because people don't know what that is unless you're part of the Yacht Club. And they do the toy drive, and it was right after the crash of 2008 when everybody was feeling poor and sad or whatever. And although not that night, that was lighted boat parade is my favorite of the events. So the next day I called the San Francisco Firefighters Toy Program and I asked them what did they need, and they said they had nothing for teenage girls. And it was like a kick in the stomach because I remember being a teenage girl, especially 12 and 13, which is a very hard age. I remember feeling insecure then, and I couldn't imagine how there's people or girls in our society that were just forgotten, and they're receiving messages all day long that they're not worth it and not even worth it enough to get a toy from a toy program. And so I asked my friends and my sister-in-laws, Brooke and Eileen, and probably Ellen and you and everybody that I knew, would you please, give me your previously treasured costume jewelry? And the first year we gave 800 gifts, and we thought we had boiled the ocean. And the fire department was so thrilled with us because they said we didn't just give gifts, but we gave the good gifts, because we have rules that no gift can disappoint, and the intention of the gift is just as important as the actual gift. But since then, we've really grown our mission. So our mission is to inspire every girl to envision and realize her full potential. And so we still have we have our 3 programs. We have our Gifts and Goods program, where we provide self-confidence to these girls through our Gifts and Goods program. But then we also provide relatable role models through our Empower Hours and Days of Empowerment, where girls come and they can get tips, kind of a little bit like this, where they can get tips on how to find careers or how to choose a career and things like that. And then we'll have a panel, and it's usually sponsored by a company like Sephora or First Republic. The coolest one by far was the cast and crew of the Broadway show Wicked, which was amazing. And then the women on the panel of all ages, mainly of color, because 86% of the girls we serve are of color, they tell us how they got there and how they overcome issues or problems, etc. And so that's really exciting. And then the third program we have is continued ongoing support, which we have our one-on-one counseling and one-on-one mentorship. And so those are the 3 programs. So far, we've served 700,000 girls across the country. We're a national brand. We are in all 50 states. We've put together a sustainability program, which we call our social supply chain, where we work with major brands like Sephora and Kendra Scott and The Balm and Rocksbox and Procter & Gamble, et cetera, where we take last season's goods that are still very beautiful, still nice, they're high margin products, and instead of putting them in landfill, we actually can put them through our system, and so everybody's winning, and we're highly sustainable. So it's been an amazing journey, and I think we really are truly changing the lives of girls, because these girls who believe in themselves literally have the ability to change the world. And you look at people like Mayor London Breed and Poet Laureate Amanda Gorman and Vice President Kamala Harris. They all started out in a poor situation, and they had people who believed in them and accomplished, and we hope to do that at scale. So It's really exciting.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you, because you are, I mean, you are helping women become the leaders that we need them to become, which is my whole series, guys. Leadership series.
And I really believe that power in societies should match the population, right? It makes no sense that we have so few congresswomen and senators and, you know, commodores, hate to say it, you know, but we need to have more women in all kinds of positions of leadership. I think it'll just be better. I mean, for men and women, it's not just better
Yeah,
for
that's
all
what
of
I was going to say. So Ellen, I would love to get your, like, what advice, you know, what qualities do you think would help women and young men and women? I actually think we can, you know, you can be mentors to everybody, become leaders. What is a quality that brings somebody success when they're right? What do you see when you're in these boardrooms? The thing that light you, because when you're investing in companies, you're really investing in people. You're choosing the people, I would imagine. I don't know. So what is it, that quality that you're like, I'm going to give this person a chance? Or when you see something, you're like, I know that that person's going to go somewhere.
Yeah. Well, so I'll try to break it down. Some of it's leadership, definitely, but there's also like the entrepreneurial part of it for they're going to go somewhere is also intriguing. And I don't think they're that far apart. I mean, I think for the entrepreneurial side, just to get that out of the way, the curiosity and also like a questioning behavior, right? So just why does it have to be this way? It's that person who's always going why when they're a little kid and like does it have like why can't you do it this way? And so trying to just see it that way. And I actually am a really big fan when I see people who take that even a step further and can see it from everybody else's perspective, right? Like if you can put yourself in other people's shoes, because usually you get really good ideas if you step out of your own vantage point. But I also think that helps transition into good leadership. So partly being able to be empathetic and understanding of other situations because you can put yourself in them. But for leadership, you know, I am particularly biased towards kind of the soft leadership, which is you almost compel people by the way you act yourself. It's not a dominant form. It's looking out for other people as long as they deserve it, to start with benefit of the doubt. But what's interesting to me is this belief that you have to be hard charging and that you have to, you know, tell people what to do. I think the most interesting people are the ones who, you know, I always say my favorite person, if you had to have a metric and then you stack rank everyone you know in business and the favorite people are at the top, I always say my metric is actually a delta. So it's cheating. It's two things put together, but it's the difference between the ego that somebody has and what they deserve to have. Right. And so, you know, if you have a big delta, it means you both deserve to have a big ego and you don't have one. Right. Like it's the gap. But that ego means there's confidence in what you do. You lead by example, just having ideas that people can follow. But you're also willing to change if you're wrong, right? So self-confidence, I find the worst leaders by far are the insecure leaders. Because when they're insecure, they'll defend themselves and try to make themselves look good and go through unnatural acts. And I think that's probably the single most prevalent form of dysfunction I see with a lot of the leaders I work with. They may be good leaders, but you know what? If you challenge them on anything, they'll cover up to make sure that it doesn't compromise how people see them as great people. Where, you know, really good leaders go, you know what? I was wrong on that one. We're going to change it, and here's how we're going to do it, right? Because I think that gets long-term respect.
Oh, I love that. I just want to like take notes on all of this. This is so great. And I really think it's going to be so helpful for so many people out there. So I just have to say, I wanted to say, I appreciate you guys both coming. There's so much more to talk about. I'm going to put a quick plug for Alpha. It's called the Alpha Girls.
Alpha Girls, yeah.
That's going to turn into a TV show and featuring all of these incredible women. And we'll have that link on our site for you guys. I did want to introduce my husband, Commodore Dana. Before we get on to the question answer, he really encouraged me. And I've got to say, I read one of the questions, how do you balance work and home? And I know Ellen and Sonja, you would agree, you balance work and home when you have someone who is supporting you and is letting you try something new. And when you get deep into a book and you're reading and you don't hear anything else in the room because you're so focused on that, they'll make the dinner or turn off the oven or finish, you know, whatever they need to do so you can get that project off its feet. So Commodore Dana, are you in the room?
I am. I've been kind of lurking. I scrolled through to see if there's any other men here, and I don't know if there's a whole lot more than me, but anyway, quite inspiring. Thank you all for doing this. This is actually an incredibly cool thing to do. It was Lisa's vision to make this happen, and she totally pulled it off. She was a little stressed out this morning, and everyone, helped her out. So this is great. I think this is going to be a really awesome thing. Hopefully we can do this in person, in a few months. But thanks, Lisa, and thanks to the speakers, and thanks for everyone for showing up.
Great.
Well,
And so now if we want to go through the questions, Jen McHugh and Lisa Gilmore have just been huge resource for me. So maybe if you can alternate on some questions. I don't know if you've been reading through them. I don't know, Jen, do you want to start with one? Do you hear me, Jen?
Sure. Yes. Hi, everyone. So this is from Jackie Pettis, and she's been working part-time on her startup for 10 years, and she's ready to go into high gear. Can she still call it a startup? At what point? After 10 years.
Sonja, you want to take that one?
I don't know anything about the company. I mean, I think some people still call Uber a startup. So you can call it whatever you want. Just own it, right?
Great, Lisa, you want to take the
So,
next?
hey, so I see it. Yeah, I see a question. It was one of the earlier questions from Kelly. She said, I read about so many companies leaving the Bay Area. Are you seeing that? And if so, what's the potential impact?
My take on it is, yes, I'm seeing some of it. I also think at least the ones I'm seeing that are very high profile about, entrepreneurs and like bastions of Silicon Valley picking up and moving to Miami or to Texas. I mean, at least the ones I know. There may be a lot of others, but some of those that are moving are the strongest libertarians I've ever known. And there's a lot of other things going on, but it becomes a story about leave Silicon Valley. It's terrible. So I think a lot of things are getting mixed in together. Some of the companies saying they're leaving already had offices in the other locations, and the CEOs didn't have their primary residence here anyway. So I think in terms of the press, the story is overblown, but I do think it's a trend that's starting to pick up. I mean, look, it's inevitable. When it gets so incredibly expensive to be here, there are more and more problems which make people feel less comfortable raising families here, or feeling safe, or being able to afford what they want. And then, of course, with the pandemic, it all of a sudden opened up options. So I do think I see that. I've done a lot of investing. Probably 75% of the startups I've invested in over the last 9 years. Again, this is all in my angel investing capacity. So early stage companies. About 75% of maybe 80 companies have been here in Silicon Valley, 75, 80%. And then I've done some outside in different geographies, usually because my network introduces me to something, whether other parts of the US, or I've done a couple in Canada and a couple in London. And the network's just not the same. I mean, there's something very magical about Silicon Valley. People know each other, and not just VC knows VC and entrepreneur, you know who the potential customers are, you know who the late stage investors are, you know who the potential acquirers are. If you don't know something, there's information just down the street at your favorite university. I mean, it's hard to replicate that. And so it's not like I think there's an implosion happening in Silicon Valley. It may be smoothing out the curve a little bit as other places pick up some of the opportunity. I don't know if Sonja, you feel the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I think something had to give, right? I mean, it was so expensive to live here, and when people are paying half their income in rent, I mean, that's just really hard to maintain. And I think the pandemic has opened a lot of opportunities of place, right? And where people can live wherever they want, and people don't have to be in their offices. We've seen a dramatic change this year, which was all 100% forced. But it'll be very interesting to see what happens, after the summer, when we're not forced to be, we can be wherever we want other than home. And I think it's gonna come back a little bit. But I live in San Francisco, and I think a big problem is it just feels very unsafe in the city, in many places, and that just really needs to be cleaned up, because we had this amazing reputation as the best city in the world, but people get their stuff stolen out of their cars at the Yacht Club, and it's just not.
The thing I'm think is going to come to a head here pretty soon on this question is Now that people have moved, right? So they're still working for their companies headquartered in Silicon Valley. They used to work here in the Bay Area and they've moved. Companies are now having to start to think about like, so do we still pay them the same salary? And all of a sudden it's an artifact of like where I actually sat in a day. But what if I worked at this company, but I traveled a lot? Like, why should they get more than I get? And so I think it's going to make it really hard for companies to figure out compensation, among other things. And I think it'll be a rude awakening when somebody who's thinking it's great that they picked up and moved to some Midwest. I grew up in the Midwest, moved to some Midwest town, but it's still pulling in San Francisco salaries, is all of a sudden compensated more like they're in the Midwest. But I think that's going to be a huge mess. And I think it's coming very quickly. I think that's going to be one of the first ones that show how we just don't have a mental model for what we're doing right now.
And I think all the people who moved to Texas are really missing the California weather right now.
That's great. There's a question about if you think there's more opportunities for women today in Silicon Valley compared to when you guys all started out.
Oh, I definitely do. I mean, I think both opportunities, I think a lot more is being brought to light, but also, at least judging personal experience and a lot of folks around me, the network of women where it's not like women got together, like in our case in venture and investing and said, we will fight back. It's just organically grown up that you're now getting people who are in their 40s and 50s and 60s who've been in Silicon Valley 30 years, who know this industry, who've got successes under their belt, but they're coming at it saying, I want people to have more opportunity. I mean, whether it's the way Sonja is going about both venture with Broadway Angels, but also even Project Glimmer for young girls coming up. There's so much of that going on that I feel like there's not just a safety net, but a bunch of resources at my disposal that just weren't there early on. Like before, when I was just getting out of grad school, I felt like maybe I found one or two individuals and those were great. They helped me a lot, but it's not the same as realizing there's this network of folks who got some shared experiences, but also kind of shared objectives for how do we fix some of this. I mean, like Sonja mentioned, Venture's a good example of an extreme case, 8% women partners, when there's no logical reason why it couldn't be 50-50. There's nothing that says there's a difference between genders that would make one better at it than the other.
Yeah,
So-
I think the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter movement have really made workplaces better for women and for Black people and people of color, because in the olden days, people didn't talk about women's issues or minority issues, and it just wasn't even like on the table. And now there's so much data, there's so much research that shows diverse teams make better outcomes. And so businesses today are looking at their boards, they're looking at their management teams, they're looking at all levels of their employees, and they're saying we need to have diversity because we will have better outcomes. And that data, I would say, is relatively new. And with the whole Alpha Girls tour, I met many CEOs on Dropbox and various companies and DocuSign, and they were dying to meet the Alpha Girls because they really wanted to know how to hire more people and what did they look like, and it was very funny, but they really wanted to do something to change the diverse outlook in their companies, and that's like that's a board topic now. That was never a board topic until relatively recently. And so I think that really is making a lot of opportunities, and I think people are also seeing that it's not the mold. It doesn't have to be the Harvard MBA and the founder of a successful company and XYZ. It can be multiple backgrounds to have the same job and have great outcomes with the people in those jobs.
I have a question about that, actually, that you brought up education and where, what matters with what school you went to. We're seeing it's just so hard for kids to get into college and choose the right path. Do you think that it matters? Do you think that you have to have that Harvard MBA or you guys have?
I mean, I have a Harvard MBA and it really helped a ton.
I don't have a Harvard MBA, but every time I met somebody who did, I'd memorize what class they were in. And then when I met somebody else from that class, I'd say, you must know Sonja, she's class of 1993. And then it was like I was in their class, but I didn't have to pay for the MBA. I just kind of jumped in.
But here's my hack for education. So it's hard to get in first year to all the top schools. It is not hard to get into all the top schools second year. So if you really want to get a brand name school, just go to the feeder school the first year and then apply. I mean, if that's what you really want. And so I just put that out there.
The other thing I'd say is it certainly helps, but it's less of a requirement now. So one of my passion projects besides doing my angel investing is I work with the president of Arizona State University. And I think most of us on this Zoom, when at least when I was in school, that was considered a party school. It wasn't really bad, but it wasn't good. It was just a party school. And if you look at ASU now, it's 6 years and counting, been named the most innovative university in the country. And that's by polling presidents, provosts, and deans. So it's of the peers. It's not some esoteric ranking system. And up until 2 years ago, number 2 was Stanford, and number 3 was MIT. And so one of the things that's fascinating is as education's changing, I think we're going to see the reputational value changing. So I think there's a lot of credit you get. Now, the thing I'll say is while ASU has been going up in every metric possible, they also have intentionally made sure that their student body represents society, right? So I won't get the numbers exactly right, but it's something like 25% of their students come from families below the poverty line. They have the same kind of diversity, mixed representation of all kinds of different minority groups in their student body. The numbers of students who are first time in their family to go to college is off the charts. And yet they can have success happen. And so, watching what's happening with those students right now gives me a lot of hope that it's not just about could you get in, and not only get in, but pay for and make it through the process of these elite universities, which I think there's enormous value to the elite universities. But I'm seeing alternative pathways, with ASU being an unbelievable example, that I think will let people get to where they need to go and have the skills ready to do it. So it's changing. It's just, it's a lot easier if somebody else already did the vetting for you and you're getting somebody smart, because those schools have smart people. They're not all the smart people, but if that's all you're going to do is look there, it certainly still helps.
Yeah, that's great, because I think that is really crippled kids for a long time, like feeling like they weren't at the right place or weren't at the right school. I think actually the pandemic has changed that, because they're not there anyway. So they're having all very different experiences. And if I'm not going to really be there, do I want to spend that money, or do I not want to spend that money, or where do I want to get the best education? Do you think secondary educate, like that extra degree, is important? Not just an MBA, but something, as people now have online and you can do things at night.
Personally, I think for women it is. I mean, women, I think that women are hired based on what is known and what they have done and what they can do. Men get hired because of potential. And so there's just a lot more boxes that women have to check. So, I mean, sadly, it's a reality, and hopefully it'll change, because I think a lot of the bias is unconscious, but it doesn't hurt. It definitely doesn't hurt.
Got it.
And Ellen's got a PhD. When I met her, I was so intimidated.
I know, right?
I always say, if you actually hear me saying it's Dr. Ellen Levy, somebody in the room has pissed me off, because otherwise I don't really say it that often. But yeah, it certainly helps kind of like shore up your defenses when somebody's not treating you well.
Yeah.
Well, I just want
and then again, I'm not a real doctor either, Lisa. You can say that.
First, I just want to say thank you. I can't say thank you enough. I was at this great ceremony for a young man, and it was his bar mitzvah. And he said, my grandfather said you can never say thank you enough. And I've got to say, you women, and Belle, thank you so much for supporting this, for supporting me, for hopefully inspiring our people who are watching this, men and women, young and old. So I really wanted to say thank you. I know we're all really excited to get back to the Yacht Club, and I can't wait to see you there live and in person. I feel like I got to know each of you a little bit better, and I really feel so grateful.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank everyone for coming. How great.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. I look forward to meeting everyone in person.
I know. I think we all do. Great. Well, do you have any last notes? Otherwise, I'd say thank you so much for doing this. I always think that everybody shouldn't be on Zoom for more than an hour, because we should be doing something else. But reading a book.
All I want to say is I want to second your comment that I couldn't do what I do without my husband behind me. I mean, Ken, as I think a lot of you know Ken, but he's been incredibly supportive throughout, like in a way that I wouldn't have imagined somebody would, even if they're being thoughtful. So I'll give him a lot of credit along the way too.
Okay, I have to give my husband credit. The captain fun. He's been so fun during this pandemic, and he's so great with Tess, and so great with our parents, and
Yep.
You know, it really, we're very blessed to have great sailing husbands.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, thank you. And I hope everybody will be back next month to meet our awesome Olympic hopefuls or medal hopefuls. And thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. This was really awesome.
Bye,
Thank you,
guys.
everyone.
Thank you.
Take care. Stay healthy.
Fantastic.